The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of Tennessee as 17-year-old Mary Beth Thompson stepped onto the front porch of her family's modest farmhouse. Her calloused hands gripped a steaming cup of coffee, the bitter aroma mixing with the sweet scent of honeysuckle that climbed the wooden railings. To anyone passing by on the dusty country road, she looked like every other farm girl in Hickory County. Sun-kissed blonde hair braided down her back, a simple cotton dress that had seen better days, and worn leather boots that spoke of countless hours spent tending to animals and crops. But appearances, as the saying goes, can be deceiving. Mary Beth had learned to shoot before she could properly read. Her father, Samuel Thompson, was a quiet man who believed every person on his land should know how to protect themselves and their property. The Tennessee hills were not always as peaceful as they appeared, especially during the harsh economic times that gripped the nation in the early 1930s. Desperate men did desperate things, and Samuel wanted his daughter to be prepared for anything. What started as basic lessons with an old rifle quickly revealed something extraordinary. Mary Beth possessed a natural talent that defied explanation. She could hit a tin can at 50 yards without breaking a sweat, and by age 15 she was consistently hitting targets that seasoned hunters struggled with. Her younger brother Jake often joked that she could shoot the wings off a fly without harming the rest of it, but there was truth hidden in his exaggeration. The Thompson family kept Mary Beth's exceptional marksmanship largely to themselves. In their conservative community, such skills in a young woman were viewed with suspicion and concern. People expected girls to focus on cooking, sewing, and preparing for marriage, not developing abilities that belonged in the realm of men. So Mary Beth played her part perfectly, attending church socials with a bright smile, helping her mother with the harvest preserving, and charming the local townspeople with her sweet demeanor and quick wit. Life in Hickory County moved at the pace of the seasons, until the summer when everything changed. Reports began filtering in from neighboring towns about a gang of ruthless criminals who called themselves the Black Creek Boys. Led by a man known only as Iron Jack Morrison, they had been terrorizing rural communities across 3 states, robbing banks, stealing livestock, and leaving a trail of violence in their wake. The gang had earned their fearsome reputation through calculated brutality. They didn't just take money and valuables, they made examples of anyone who dared to resist. In the town of Cedar Falls, 60 miles north, they had burned down the general store when the owner tried to hide his cash register money. In Millerville, they had beaten a sheriff's deputy so badly that he never walked properly again. Local law enforcement seemed powerless against their hit-and-run tactics, and the state authorities were spread too thin to provide adequate protection to every small town and farming community. Mary Beth first heard about the Black Creek Boys while sitting in Murphy's general store, where she had come to pick up supplies for her mother. The store served as the unofficial gathering place for local gossip, and on this particular afternoon the conversation was dominated by fearful whispers about the gang's latest activities. "They hit the bank in Cooperstown yesterday," said Mrs. Henderson, the postmaster's wife, her voice barely above a whisper. "Took everything and shot up the place something fierce. Poor Mr. Caldwell is still laid up with a bullet in his shoulder." Old Pete McCarthy, a veteran of the Great War who rarely spoke about anything more serious than the weather, shook his head gravely. "Heard they're moving this way, following the mountain roads and hitting every settlement they come across. Sheriff Davis says we should all be extra careful and report anything suspicious." Mary Beth listened carefully while pretending to examine a bolt of fabric her mother had requested. The fear in the adults' voices was palpable, and she could see it in their faces as well. These were people who had survived droughts, floods, and economic hardships, but the prospect of facing the Black Creek Boys had them genuinely terrified. That evening at dinner, her father confirmed what she had heard in town. Samuel Thompson was not a man given to unnecessary worry, but his expression was serious as he addressed his family. "The gang is definitely heading this way," he said, cutting his cornbread with deliberate precision. Sheriff Davis came by this afternoon to warn all the farming families. They expect the Black Creek boys to reach our area within the week. Mary Beth's mother, Sarah, set down her fork with a slight tremor in her hands. "What are we supposed to do, Samuel? We can't just leave the farm." "We're not leaving," Samuel replied firmly. "This is our land, and we've worked too hard to build what we have here. But we need to be smart about things. I'm going to move most of our cash to the bank in town, and we'll keep the rifles loaded and close at hand." Jake, who was 15 and eager to prove his courage, straightened in his chair. "I can help guard the property, Pa. I'm a good shot." Samuel nodded approvingly at his son's spirit, but maintained his serious expression. "We all need to be prepared to defend ourselves if it comes to that. Mary Beth, I know this isn't the kind of thing we usually ask you to worry about, but these are unusual circumstances." Mary Beth met her father's gaze steadily. "I understand, Pa. I'll do whatever needs to be done." What her family didn't fully realize was that Mary Beth had already been thinking about the problem from a different angle. While they were focused on defensive preparations, she was considering more proactive solutions. Her exceptional shooting skills, combined with her intimate knowledge of the local terrain, gave her capabilities that none of them had fully contemplated. The next few days passed with agonizing slowness. Every unfamiliar sound drew nervous glances, and every stranger on the road was viewed with suspicion. Mary Beth continued her daily routines, but she also began making quiet preparations of her own. She checked and cleaned her father's hunting rifles, familiarized herself with the ammunition supply, and spent extra time studying the approaches to their property. The Black Creek boys had a pattern, she realized after listening to more accounts of their activities. They preferred to strike during the early morning hours when their targets were least prepared. They used superior numbers and intimidation to overwhelm resistance quickly, taking what they wanted and disappearing before organized pursuit could be mounted. But patterns, Mary Beth knew from her years of hunting, could be turned into weaknesses if someone was clever enough to exploit them. On Thursday morning, Sheriff Davis rode up to the Thompson farmhouse with news that chilled everyone to the bone. The gang had hit the Morrison farm, just 8 miles away, during the pre-dawn hours. The family had been roughed up but not seriously injured, and the criminals had made off with 3 months' worth of crop money and several head of cattle. "They're definitely in our area now," the sheriff said, accepting a cup of coffee from Sarah Thompson while his horse stood panting in the yard. "I'm doing my best to organize the men for patrols, but I won't lie to you folks. We're outgunned and outnumbered. These aren't simple thieves or drifters. They're organized, well-armed, and they know how to fight." Samuel Thompson studied the lawman's worried face. "How many men are we talking about, Sheriff?" "Best estimates put them at 12 to 15 members, all mounted and carrying military-style weapons. Iron Jack Morrison served in France during the war, and he's taught his boys how to move and fight like soldiers. They've got discipline and experience that most of our local men just don't have." Mary Beth absorbed this information while maintaining her typical quiet demeanor. 15 armed men represented a formidable force, but they also presented a larger target. The bigger the group, the harder it would be for them to move without being noticed, and the more difficult it would be to coordinate their activities if things went wrong. That afternoon, while helping her mother hang laundry on the line behind the house, Mary Beth made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't sit passively waiting for the gang to choose their farm as the next target. Too many innocent people had already been hurt, and the local authorities clearly lacked the resources to stop the Black Creek boys' reign of terror. As she folded her father's work shirts and listened to her mother's worried humming, Mary Beth began formulating a plan that was both audacious and dangerous. She possessed skills that could make a difference, but using them would require her to step far outside the boundaries of what was expected from a 17-year-old farm girl. The sun was setting behind the Tennessee hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple when Mary Beth finally made her choice. She would not wait for the Black Creek boys to bring their violence to her family's doorstep. Instead, she would take the fight to them, using every advantage her unique abilities provided. The sweet country girl that everyone knew was about to disappear, replaced by someone far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Friday morning arrived with an unusual chill in the air, as if nature itself sensed the tension that had settled over Hickory County. Mary Beth woke before dawn, as was her custom, but today her morning routine carried a different purpose. While her family slept, she quietly gathered the supplies she would need for what lay ahead. From her father's gun cabinet, she selected his prized Winchester rifle, the one he had brought back from his own brief military service. She knew every scratch on its wooden stock and every peculiarity of its mechanism. Along with the rifle, she packed 2 boxes of ammunition, her father's field glasses, and a hunting knife that had belonged to her grandfather. Her clothing choice was deliberate and practical. Instead of her usual dress, Mary Beth donned her brother's old work pants, a dark shirt, and her most comfortable boots. She braided her hair tightly and tucked it under a worn baseball cap that would help her blend into the shadows of the forest. Before leaving the house, she wrote a brief note to her parents, explaining that she had gone to town early to help Mrs. Murphy with preparations for the church social. It was a believable excuse that would buy her several hours before anyone began looking for her. The information Mary Beth had gathered over the past few days had revealed a crucial detail about the Black Creek Boys' operations. They had established a temporary camp in the abandoned Copper Ridge mine, about 12 miles northwest of her family's farm. The mine had been closed for nearly a decade, leaving behind a network of buildings and tunnels that provided excellent concealment for a group trying to avoid detection. Local hunters and trappers had reported seeing smoke and hearing voices in the area, but none had been brave enough to investigate closely. The gang used the camp as a base for planning their raids and dividing their stolen goods before moving on to the next target. Mary Beth had spent considerable time studying the terrain around Copper Ridge through her father's old surveying maps. The mine sat in a natural bowl surrounded by rocky hills and dense forest, with only 2 practical approaches for mounted men. This geographic bottleneck could work to her advantage if she positioned herself correctly. The trek to Copper Ridge took her through some of the most challenging terrain in the county. Mary Beth moved carefully but steadily, using game trails and creek beds to mask her passage. Her years of hunting with her father had taught her how to move silently through the forest, and she applied every skill she had learned. By mid-morning, she had reached the ridge line that overlooked the old mine complex. Crawling the final 100 yards on her belly, Mary Beth found a concealed position among a cluster of large boulders that provided both excellent cover and a clear field of fire toward the camp below. Through her father's field glasses, she could see the Black Creek Boys had indeed made themselves comfortable in the abandoned mine. Horses were picketed near the main building, while men moved casually around the camp without any apparent concern for security. Their overconfidence was understandable given their string of unopposed successes, but it would prove to be a critical weakness. Mary Beth counted 14 men in the camp, matching the sheriff's estimates. Several were cleaning weapons or tending to their horses, while others sat around a cooking fire sharing what appeared to be their breakfast. Their leader, Iron Jack Morrison, was easily identifiable by his commanding presence and the deference shown to him by the other gang members. Morrison was a large man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He wore a military-style jacket and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had faced danger many times and survived. Even from a distance, Mary Beth could sense the ruthless intelligence that had made him such an effective criminal leader. As she observed the camp, Mary Beth began to understand the gang's operational pattern more clearly. They were preparing for another raid, with several men checking their weapons and others studying what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. Their next target was likely being discussed and finalized, which meant another innocent family would soon face the terror these men brought with them wherever they went. The moral weight of what she was contemplating settled heavily on Mary Beth's shoulders. She had never harmed another human being, and taking a life was not something that could be undone once the decision was made. But as she watched the casual cruelty in the way the gang members treated their horses and spoke to each other, she knew these were not men who would respond to reason or mercy. The stories she had heard about their victims flashed through her mind. The beaten deputy in Millerville, who might never walk normally again. The shop owner in Cedar Falls, whose livelihood had been destroyed in flames. The Morrison family, terrorized in their own home just the night before. These were not isolated incidents of desperation, but deliberate acts of violence committed by men who enjoyed the fear and suffering they caused. Mary Beth made her decision with the same calm determination she brought to difficult shots while hunting. These men had made their choice to live by violence and intimidation. Now they would face the consequences of that choice. Her first target would be Iron Jack Morrison himself. Remove the leader, and the gang's coordination and morale would collapse almost instantly. Without Morrison's strategic thinking and forceful personality holding them together, the remaining members would likely scatter rather than continue their criminal activities. The distance to the camp was approximately 250 yards, well within the effective range of her Winchester rifle. The morning air was still, with virtually no wind to affect the bullet's trajectory. Mary Beth had made similar shots countless times while hunting, though never with stakes this high. She settled into her shooting position with practiced efficiency, checking every detail of her setup. The rifle's scope was properly adjusted, her breathing was steady and controlled, and her body was braced securely against the rocks to eliminate any unwanted movement. Everything was ready except for one final element. Mary Beth waited patiently for the perfect moment to present itself. She had learned from years of hunting that rushing a shot often meant missing the opportunity entirely. The key was to remain calm and alert until all the factors aligned in her favor. That moment came 20 minutes later when Iron Jack Morrison stepped away from his men to examine something near the horses. He stood in clear view with no one else in the immediate vicinity, presenting an ideal target for someone with Mary Beth's exceptional skills. She drew in a slow, deep breath and let half of it out, settling into the natural pause in her respiratory cycle where her body was most stable. Her finger found the trigger's sweet spot, applying just enough pressure to take up the slack without firing the weapon. Morrison turned slightly, presenting his left profile to her position. At this angle, a shot to his upper torso would be immediately fatal while minimizing the risk of hitting anyone else in the camp. Mary Beth made a final adjustment to her aim, accounting for the slight downward angle of her shot. The Winchester rifle spoke with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding hills. Through her scope, Mary Beth saw Morrison stumble and fall, his body going limp before he hit the ground. The shot had been perfect, striking exactly where she had intended. The reaction in the camp was immediate and chaotic. Men dove for cover behind buildings and equipment while shouting questions and curses. Several grabbed their weapons and began firing randomly at the tree line, but their shots were wild and panicked, aimed at shadows and imagination rather than any actual target. Mary Beth had already shifted her position, moving 20 yards to her right while the gang members were distracted by their initial panic. This new location offered a different angle on the camp while maintaining her concealment among the rocks and scrub brush. Her second shot came 3 minutes later, when one of the gang members made the mistake of exposing himself while trying to reach Morrison's body. The bullet caught him in the chest as he knelt beside his fallen leader, and he collapsed across Morrison's legs. The remaining gang members now understood they were under attack by someone with exceptional marksmanship skills, but they still had no idea where the shots were coming from. Their return fire became more concentrated but remained ineffective, as Mary Beth had chosen her position specifically to make herself nearly impossible to locate from the camp below. Over the next hour, the battle evolved into a deadly game of patience and precision. Mary Beth moved constantly, using the rocky terrain to her advantage while picking off gang members whenever they presented clear targets. Her hunting experience served her well, as she understood how to read her opponent's movements and anticipate their actions. The gang members grew increasingly desperate as their numbers dwindled. Several attempted to reach their horses and escape, but Mary Beth's elevated position gave her clear fields of fire that made such attempts suicidal. Others tried to organize coordinated attacks on different sections of the ridgeline, but their lack of military training showed in their poor tactics and communication. By noon, only 5 members of the Black Creek Boys remained alive, and they had taken refuge in the mine's main building. Mary Beth could hear them arguing among themselves, their voices carrying clearly in the mountain air. Some wanted to surrender, while others insisted on fighting to the death rather than face the hangman's noose. The standoff continued for another hour before the survivors finally emerged with their hands raised. Mary Beth kept them covered with her rifle while they slowly walked away from the building, but she did not fire. The immediate threat was over, and she felt no need for additional killing. From her position on the ridge, Mary Beth watched as the 5 remaining gang members mounted their horses and rode away as quickly as the terrain would allow. They disappeared into the forest, leaving behind their dead comrades, their stolen goods, and their reputation for invincibility. The legend of the Black Creek Boys had ended in a single morning, brought down by a 17-year-old farm girl who had possessed the courage to act when others could only wait and hope for the best. Mary Beth gathered her equipment and began the long journey back to her family's farm, knowing that word of what had happened at Copper Ridge would soon spread throughout the county. The sweet country girl everyone thought they knew had revealed herself to be something far more formidable, and life in Hickory County would never be quite the same again. The news of what happened at Copper Ridge spread through Hickory County like wildfire, but the initial reports were confused and contradictory. By Saturday evening, everyone knew that the Black Creek Boys had been destroyed as an effective fighting force, but nobody could agree on exactly how it had happened. Sheriff Davis was among the first to investigate the scene, arriving at the abandoned mine with 3 deputies and a growing sense of amazement. What they found defied easy explanation. 9 members of the notorious gang lay dead, including their leader Iron Jack Morrison, all killed by precisely placed rifle shots from extreme range. The accuracy required for such shooting was almost superhuman, leading to wild speculation about who could have accomplished such a feat. Some people credited a mysterious drifter, perhaps a former military sniper seeking revenge for some past wrong committed by the gang. Others whispered about federal agents or even legendary lawmen like the Texas Rangers operating secretly in their territory. A few suggested that God himself had intervened to protect the innocent people of their community. Mary Beth Thompson returned to her family's farm that Friday afternoon, slipping back into her normal routine as if nothing unusual had occurred. She helped her mother with the evening chores, listened to her father and brother discuss the strange rumors circulating in town, and maintained the same sweet, innocent demeanor that had always characterized her public persona. Her parents noticed nothing different about their daughter's behavior, though her father did comment that she seemed unusually tired for someone who had supposedly spent the day helping at the general store. Mary Beth explained her fatigue as the result of moving heavy supplies and dealing with the stress of all the talk about the gang. Sunday morning brought a packed church service as the entire community gathered to hear Sheriff Davis provide an official account of the previous day's discoveries. The lawman looked exhausted and somewhat bewildered as he addressed the congregation from the front of the small church. "I can confirm that the threat posed by the Black Creek Boys has been eliminated," Davis announced, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet sanctuary. 9 members of the gang, including their leader, were found dead at the old Copper Ridge mine. The remaining members appear to have fled the area and are no longer considered a danger to our community. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the church, followed immediately by a buzz of excited conversation. Families who had spent the past week in fear could finally relax, knowing their children were safe and their property secure. However, the sheriff continued, raising his hand for silence, the identity of the person or persons responsible for this outcome remains unknown. What I can tell you is that whoever did this possessed exceptional marksmanship skills and intimate knowledge of the local terrain. The shots were fired from positions that would challenge even the most experienced military sharpshooters. Mary Beth sat quietly between her parents, her hands folded in her lap and her expression reflecting the same relief and gratitude visible on every other face in the church. Inside, however, she was carefully considering the implications of what the sheriff had revealed. The investigation would undoubtedly continue, and eventually someone might begin asking uncomfortable questions about who in the area possessed the skills necessary to accomplish what had been done at Copper Ridge. Mary Beth knew she would have to be very careful about maintaining her innocent facade while the authorities searched for answers. Over the following weeks, life in Hickory County gradually returned to normal. Farmers ventured out to work their fields without fear, merchants reopened their shops with confidence, and children played outside without constant supervision. The terror that had gripped the community vanished as completely as if it had never existed, but the mystery of the unknown marksman continued to generate intense interest and speculation. Sheriff Davis interviewed dozens of local hunters and veterans, trying to identify someone with the necessary skills and opportunity. Several men were questioned closely, but all had solid alibis for the crucial time period. The investigation might have continued indefinitely if not for an unexpected development that occurred 3 weeks after the incident at Copper Ridge. A traveling journalist named Harold Preston arrived in the county, drawn by the dramatic story of the gang's destruction. Preston had covered numerous similar incidents across the country and prided himself on uncovering details that others missed. Preston spent several days interviewing witnesses and examining the scene of the battle. His experience allowed him to read the evidence more effectively than the local authorities, and he quickly realized that the shooting had been accomplished by a single individual rather than a team of attackers. More significantly, Preston's analysis of the bullet trajectories and shooting positions led him to conclude that the unknown marksman had possessed not only exceptional skill, but also remarkable physical conditioning. Moving between the various firing positions while maintaining accuracy would have required someone in peak physical condition with years of experience in difficult terrain. This insight caused Preston to reconsider his assumptions about the likely identity of the mysterious shooter. Instead of focusing exclusively on men with military backgrounds, he began investigating other possibilities, including hunters and outdoors enthusiasts who might possess the necessary combination of skills and local knowledge. Mary Beth first became aware of Preston's presence when she encountered him at Murphy's General Store on a Thursday afternoon. The journalist was questioning Mrs. Murphy about local hunters and shooters, particularly anyone known for exceptional accuracy with a rifle. "I'm especially interested in anyone who might be familiar with the area around Copper Ridge," Preston explained, consulting a small notebook filled with handwritten observations. "The person I'm looking for would have extensive knowledge of the terrain and probably years of experience moving quietly through the forest." Mrs. Murphy considered his questions thoughtfully before responding. "Well, there's old Pete McCarthy, but he's got arthritis something fierce and can barely hold a rifle steady anymore. Samuel Thompson is probably the best shot in the area, but he was home with his family the whole time, according to Sheriff Davis." "What about Thompson's children?" Preston asked casually. Do they share their father's shooting abilities? His boy Jake is a decent shot for his age, but nothing special. His daughter Mary Beth is sweet as can be, but she's just a typical farm girl. Spends most of her time helping her mother with domestic chores and such. Mary Beth continued browsing the fabric bolts while listening to this conversation, but she felt a growing unease about the journalist's methodical approach to his investigation. Preston was clearly more experienced and perceptive than the local authorities, and his questions suggested he was beginning to consider possibilities that others had dismissed. That evening, Mary Beth mentioned the journalist's presence to her family during dinner, carefully framing it as casual gossip rather than anything of particular concern. "There's a newspaper writer in town asking questions about what happened at Copper Ridge," she said while passing a bowl of green beans to her brother. "Mrs. Murphy says he's trying to figure out who killed those gang members." Samuel Thompson frowned thoughtfully. "I suppose that's natural enough. It was certainly an unusual situation, and people are curious about how it all happened." "Sheriff Davis asked me about it again yesterday," Jake added. "Wanted to know if I'd seen or heard anything suspicious that morning. I told him the same thing I've been telling everyone. I was asleep until well after sunrise and never left the farm that day." Mary Beth nodded approvingly at her brother's answer. "I'm just glad the whole thing is over, and we don't have to worry about those terrible men anymore." Over the next few days, Preston continued his investigation with growing intensity. He visited the Thompson farm on Saturday morning, ostensibly to interview Samuel about local hunting practices and shooting traditions. Mary Beth made sure to be busy with household chores during the visit, maintaining her image as a domestic-minded young woman with little interest in such masculine pursuits. "Your daughter seems like a lovely girl," Preston commented to Samuel as they stood on the front porch discussing the area's wildlife. "Does she share your interest in hunting and shooting?" Samuel glanced toward the kitchen window where Mary Beth could be seen washing dishes. "She's learned the basics for safety reasons, but her interests run more toward helping her mother and preparing for eventual marriage. Mary Beth is a traditional girl with traditional values." Preston nodded agreeably, but Mary Beth noticed that his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than seemed casual. She had the uncomfortable feeling that the journalist's questions were not as random as they appeared. That suspicion proved correct when Preston returned to the farm on Monday afternoon, this time asking specifically to speak with Mary Beth herself. Her parents saw nothing unusual in the request, assuming the journalist wanted to interview a typical young woman about life in rural Tennessee. "I'm writing an article about how the gang's presence affected different members of the community," Preston explained as they sat on the front porch with her mother present as a chaperone. "I'd particularly like to hear a young woman's perspective on living under that kind of threat." Mary Beth answered his questions carefully, emphasizing her fear during the crisis and her relief at its resolution. She portrayed herself as someone who had spent the entire period worrying about her family's safety while trying to maintain normal domestic routines. "It must have been especially frightening for someone in your situation," Preston said sympathetically. "A young woman would be particularly vulnerable to the kind of men who made up that gang." "I tried not to think about it too much," Mary Beth replied softly. "My parents were very protective, and I knew they would do everything possible to keep me safe." Preston's questions continued for another 10 minutes, covering topics that seemed innocuous enough on the surface. But Mary Beth detected an underlying purpose to his inquiries, as if he were testing her responses against some private theory he had developed. The truth of Preston's suspicions became clear the following day when Sheriff Davis arrived at the Thompson farm with a very different kind of request. The journalist had shared his conclusions with the authorities, and they wanted to conduct a more detailed investigation of Mary Beth's activities on the day the gang was destroyed. "I want to be clear that you're not under suspicion of any wrongdoing," Sheriff Davis explained to the assembled family. "But Mr. Preston has raised some questions that need to be addressed for the sake of completing our investigation." Samuel Thompson's face darkened with anger. Are you seriously suggesting that my 17-year-old daughter had something to do with killing 9 armed men? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. I understand your reaction, Samuel, but we need to be thorough. Preston has pointed out some inconsistencies in the evidence that deserve further examination. Mary Beth realized that the moment of truth had finally arrived. She could continue protesting her innocence, but Preston's investigation had apparently uncovered enough evidence to make that position increasingly untenable. The choice was between maintaining her deception and facing the consequences of revealing what she had actually done. Looking at the faces of her family members, Mary Beth saw confusion, anger, and growing concern. They deserved to know the truth about what she had accomplished, even if that truth challenged everything they thought they knew about her. "It's all right, Sheriff," Mary Beth said quietly, her voice carrying a new note of confidence and authority. "Mr. Preston is correct in his suspicions. I was the one who went to Copper Ridge that day." The silence that followed her confession was profound and absolute. Her parents stared at her in shock, while Jake's mouth fell open in amazement. Sheriff Davis leaned back in his chair as if he had been physically struck by her words. "You killed those men?" her father asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I stopped them from hurting any more innocent people," Mary Beth replied firmly. "They were planning another raid, probably against our farm or one of our neighbors. Someone had to act, and I had the skills to do what needed to be done." Over the next hour, Mary Beth provided a complete account of her actions at Copper Ridge, describing her planning, her positioning, and the careful precision with which she had eliminated the gang's leadership. Her family listened in stunned silence as their sweet domestic daughter revealed herself to be one of the most effective marksmen any of them had ever encountered. When she finished her story, Sheriff Davis shook his head in amazement. "Mary Beth, what you did was extraordinarily dangerous and probably saved dozens of lives, but it was also completely outside the bounds of normal law enforcement procedures." "I understand that, Sheriff. But normal law enforcement wasn't working against the Black Creek Boys. They had terrorized people across 3 states, and everything suggested they would continue until someone stopped them permanently." Samuel Thompson looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. "All these years, I thought I was teaching you basic self-defense. I never realized you had developed such advanced capabilities." "I didn't want anyone to know," Mary Beth explained. "In our community, such skills in a young woman would have been seen as inappropriate or even dangerous. I thought it was better to let people see what they expected to see." The aftermath of Mary Beth's revelation brought changes that rippled far beyond Hickory County. Preston's article about the teenage sharpshooter who single-handedly destroyed a notorious gang was picked up by newspapers across the country, making Mary Beth Thompson a national sensation virtually overnight. Marriage proposals arrived by the dozen from men who were intrigued by her combination of feminine charm and deadly competence. Job offers came from law enforcement agencies and private security companies who recognized the value of her exceptional abilities. Hollywood producers inquired about the movie rights to her story, envisioning dramatic films about the sweet country girl who became an unlikely hero. But Mary Beth herself remained largely unchanged by the attention and fame. She continued helping her mother with household chores, attending church with her family, and maintaining the same sweet demeanor that had always characterized her interactions with others. The only significant difference was that she no longer felt the need to hide her true capabilities. When the county organized shooting competitions, Mary Beth participated openly and won consistently. When neighboring communities faced similar threats, they knew exactly who to call for assistance. The sweet country girl everyone thought they knew had revealed herself to be something far more complex and formidable, but in the end, that revelation only made the people of Hickory County appreciate her more deeply. Knowing they had been protected all along by someone truly extraordinary who had chosen to use her gifts in service of others rather than for personal gain. Mary Beth Thompson had proven that appearances could indeed be deceiving, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes were the ones who made the greatest difference when courage and skill were needed most.